Hello and welcome once again to Advanced Exercise Physiology. We're looking at the end of the week for our week 11 of 16 at Concordia University. And of course, we're finishing chapter 6 for principles for testing and training for aerobic power. This will get us at least 90% of the way through that chapter. There's just a little bit left that we'll be covering the first part of next week. This will certainly be enough for any of the content that you might be seeing on your exam. There won't be much from this chapter anyway. There'll be a little bit. That being said, this should get us on our way to finishing this chapter and these concepts. First of all, referring to protocols for assessing aerobic power. Lab testing for aerobic power is determined using an open circuit gas exchange, which we've seen using the spirometer we've used for testing RER in our classroom. It simply means free flow of both oxygen intake and carbon dioxide output. There's not something blocking it in any way there. While exercise is performed on a treadmill or an ergometer with graded work increases. Now, there's situations where you might have just a steady state and there's not graded work increases. That can happen in some assessments, but there usually is, at least to some extent. And of course, we'll talk more about when you might be using an ergometer versus a treadmill, meaning a different form of aerobic testing versus a treadmill. And that said, the more consistent we have it with the same setup, of course, making sure that when we come back and test again, we test in the exact same way so we make sure that we can see consistent, reliable results from a standpoint of changes. As always, whenever you're retesting, you want to be looking at making sure you can get adequate or accurate, we should say, results from a standpoint of where you were last time you did it. And when we do testing in general, if we want to see physiological changes, probably anything less than 4 weeks is not likely to show you anything that's probably worth really noting. If you're curious, you can always do testing as often as you want, but that can be kind of difficult, especially with really specific clinical type testing. Hard to do unless if you're testing a lot of people anyway on a real regular basis. Probably the more ideal time frame is anywhere between 6, 8 to 12 weeks, somewhere in there, like a little under 2 months to about 3 months-ish. And of course, obviously, you want to keep doing that ongoing if you can. That said, testing should be performed when possible on the specific exercise type. As I was kind of alluding to, if you are a person who are sort of an athlete and they're running, you want them on a treadmill. If they're the regular everyday person, you probably want them on a treadmill, not a bike, not a rowing machine. Not that you can't use those machines, but we're not just testing here for just changes in physiological differences internally, but also for life performance. So we want to be clear what the goal is. If you're just trying to assess someone's overall health, honestly, any version of a test for aerobic power is going to be just fine. But if you're looking at performance and something that's going to be giving you the greatest indication of performance improvement, life performance / athletic performance, you want to use whatever tool you have available, if you have it available, that most simulates the way you would move in normal situations. Okay? Because they're using certain skeletal muscles that are and movement skills, coordination-wise, technique-wise, from a standpoint of nervous system-wise, endocrine system-wise. You want to be specific to that, which means 90% of the time, in my opinion, unless you're talking about cyclists or rowers or swimmers, that you want to have them on a treadmill when we're doing these tests. There are 3 potential variations now in VO2 max testing suggested by your textbook by Irvine et al. The Bruce treadmill test, which you've done in class before, and 406. I don't remember if we got a chance to do that with 416 with you guys at Advanced X Phys, but it's really meant for not health individuals, but healthy individuals, and it starts about 1.5 mile, goes about up every 1.5 miles per hour, starting at about 2.7 miles per hour, and it increases every 3 minutes. It starts at 10% grade, with a 2% grade increase every 3 minutes as well. And that's believed through the research to be the most accurate for getting reasonable results that almost anyone can do if they're healthy. Okay? And not in treadmill test is more specific toward people who have cardiovascular or respiratory disease. It starts at a 2 mile per hour base beginning with a 3.5% grade increase every 3 minutes. So it starts at a much lighter level. And that's kind of the intent for someone who has some background in breathing issues, circulation issues, obviously heart-related issues affecting them in any way aerobically. And then, of course, the athletic treadmill test, which is something we haven't done before that we're going to have to probably start implementing to some extent in the future to take a look at, starts at 8 miles per hour and stays at 8 miles per hour the whole time. You're really looking at someone who has more athletic prowess when it comes to running, right? And that said, then it goes 2 to 4% grade increase every 3 minutes. Goes up a couple percent, up to about 4%-ish. slight changes there, depending over time, until, like all these tests, until a person either decides they're done, they become exhausted, or we're looking for certain parameters that we see on our readout in doing the testing. Steady state protocols, like that athletic treadmill test with standpoint of speed, are most advantageous for comparing changes in blood pressure and heart rate over time every 2 to 3 minutes. And the reason you do every 2 to 3 minutes we'll talk about in a second as to why it's every 2 to 3 minutes, roughly speaking, for the changes that occur in graded exercise tests whenever you're changing speed and or incline, in this case with a treadmill. And of course, a bike, we would be looking at possible RPM changes and or changes in the tension of the bike. True also of a ergometer with rowing. Swimming, you can, if you have really expensive equipment in a nice facility whereby you can adjust the flow of the water, so you get resistance changes there, is really advantageous to have something like that as a possible change as well. You can change the incline with the water, right? That said, they were also looking to observe performance improvements. The steady state type protocol may be more adequate or accurate, or at least more reasonable for what you're looking to accomplish for seeing changes, just saying some change maybe in percent grade, but steady state speed. However, and as well as medication effects too. Graded tests, if only VO2 max and max heart rate are of interest, the graded tests are really adequate for what you're looking for, and of course they're very clinically accurate, which is something to note. That being said, again, if we're looking at athletes, if we're really trying to test athletes, doing an athletic treadmill type test is certainly something reasonable to do, and really see if you can see some actual consistent changes over time in terms of performance results, in specifically towards VO2 max, max heart rate, blood pressure, and just heart rate changes as you adjust speed and as you adjust intensity. Right? But Cooper test is basically more indicative of actual performance. We're talking about an aerobically trained athlete for any performance. We're talking about someone who's a basketball player, certainly a track athlete, endurance athlete, but anyone who needs to run and needs to be able to run for longer periods and longer durations of time, longer, short, brief periods with very little rest. Anyone, and even some football players, some of that kind of stuff, certain times a year, not during the football season where it's anaerobic focused, which we'll talk about at the anaerobic chapter coming up next as well. But the Cooper test is highly vital for any endurance type athlete for sure. How far can you get in 12 minutes around a track to the 10-meter mark? So you got 960 meters or 1,080 meters, and then you plug that into an equation whereby you can determine someone's essentially their aerobic capacity. And that will not be as valid from a standpoint of accurate in a clinical setting. However, absolutely more accurate from a performance standpoint for actual performance in sport, okay? Because the track also is more indicative of what surface you're going to be on. Obviously, if you could do it in a gym, if you're talking about a basketball player, probably even better, whether they're doing loops around the basketball court or doing something where they're changing directions repeatedly. However, that's pretty tough to do for some challenging tests. But there are other tests that we can actually do, and we'll probably talk a little more about those either in sometime next week, most likely. Some of the ones that are not mentioned by the text to be thinking about for performance standpoint as well. That said, age and gender is going to show some variations depending upon your age and your gender, or the age and gender of the person you're testing for cardiovascular fitness. Max VO2 typically is 15 to 20% higher in males and the average population, the normal population. It's actually about 5 to 10% difference, and it still can be more than that, but only about averaging about 5-10% difference in well-trained or elite males and females. Okay, and of course the expectation is very possibly, since these numbers are actually higher, hemoglobin numbers about 10% higher, stroke volume about 10% higher. There's a larger left ventricle for the male than the female. These are all male versus female. And I said or other, more specifically toward the fact, I thought it was on there, skeletal muscle differences. You have different muscles, mass size changes, different size and muscle mass, skeletal muscle utilized for the given aerobic performance. So you're talking about with running, obviously we're talking about your gluteus maximus, we're talking about your quadriceps, we're talking about your soleus or gastrocnemius, and even to some extent, some of the inspiratory muscles that obviously with raising the rib cage, so some of the intercostals, pectoralis major, the muscles of your neck, and shoulders, because in terms of getting shoulder flexion with arms going forward and back, you have skeletal muscle adaptation in those areas to the stress of running, as an example, then you're going to certainly see with men, because of testosterone differences and different hormonal response and genetic differences just in males versus females, generally speaking, we see, men having typically more hypertrophy, right? More genetic predisposition toward greater hypertrophy with more testosterone. So of course that's going to be potentially one of the biggest differences, not mentioned by your text because they really weren't talking specifically toward that as much as what they can measure in aerobic power test, and that's understandable. But skeletal muscle adaptation is the biggest difference there, which is one of the reasons why there's higher hemoglobin levels and stroke volume values, in addition to the simple parameters we'd expect to see changes wise in the aerobic system, okay, or so to speak, within the circulatory or vascular or respiratory systems. Now that said, max VO2 should be considered to be attained if further work increases they result in a VO2 plateau. So in other words, breathing changes don't occur even though you've changed the intensity. If there's only an increase of 150 milliliters or less when you're doing really high level equipment, then that test is over. Okay, or if the work increases but VO2 does not in general, or the RER is greater than 1.15. That will happen in people who are less trained, who basically have a specific illness or disease that might affect their respiratory or cardiovascular type performance. Okay, for maximal testing accuracy, testing should be known by the person being tested at least 4 more days in advance, so they can actually taper whatever they're doing as far as their intensity, their duration, whatever work they're doing, get enough rest, be motivated, be preparing mentally, not just physiologically, right? And they get the proper nutrient intake for a maximal testing and competitive performance. Because that's what we want to see is competitive performance. If you do a surprise test, well, it's like saying how would they respond in a surprise situation. So if that's what you want, then that's what you do. But if you actually want to see maximal results, you need to make sure people are ready for that. And that said, METs, or metabolic equivalents, are an estimate of activity intensity. They're based on expected oxygen consumption. And that is something that's been formulated over time, trying to find, understandably, a reasonable level that internationally, doing research in other areas, other parts of the world, not just other parts of the country, between universities, between all sorts of different levels and areas of population that people can agree upon, so we can see consistency when we measure in research what values we're getting from performance. In that standpoint, that makes sense. However, it isn't really necessarily still, because there's so many variations, that's kind of the point. There are still some challenges there. But it's certainly important to note that. That said, 1 MET is assumed to be equal to a person's resting VO2. Sitting quietly, I got a kick out of that, even though it makes perfect sense, just sitting quietly. Okay, so really not doing too much, right? That said, it's 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. That can be overstated by as much as 20% for someone who's ill or sedentary. They could be much lower than that. And most MET tables are based upon average responses. This is important to note too, across all populations for a 150-pound person, about 70 kilograms. So adjustments would be expected for someone who's larger or smaller. Okay. They're maybe most useful though for inactive or ill disease populations, less trained, right? Due to variations you might see more broadly in body mass, body composition, movement skill, conditioning, and genetics, especially toward the last 4. Body composition, movement skill, conditioning, and genetics. Okay, it's still going to give you important information that's valid and is consistent, but we want to make sure what we're measuring for, right? And from a standpoint of athletic performance, METs don't have a whole lot of value. But from a standpoint, we're talking about for the average population, for patient or patient care, or someone who's going through some sort of illness or disease of any kind, yeah, METs can be something to be very, very helpful for us to be looking at. And the ability to perform only 5 to 6 METs and doing a VO2 max type test is associated with high risk of mortality. When they say high risk of mortality, meaning within a few years. That's really the expectation. If you can't get more than 5 or 6 METs, barring you're sick right now, you got the flu or something like that, right? We're talking about someone who's not different than they've been the last several months, and they come and do this test and they don't get more than 5 or 6 METs. There's some real serious concerns there. And training at more than at least 4.5 METs, so getting to that 5, is associated with a 97% event-free survival rate of at least a year for cardiac patients. That might sound kind of grim, but at the same time, that's at least knowing you're at least doing okay. And obviously means we want to see a much higher result if at all possible. Now, the American College of Sports Medicine, that does a lot of research in the athletic performance avenues, or more toward fitness, both, and health. But they're really, American College of Sports Medicine is really trying to gear it a little more toward broad-based, including some athletic populations, not just average populations, at least more towards general fitness and exercise and what they expect to see. And that said, 2 to 3 METs defined by ACSM is relatively light activity, more or less. I mean, it's not exactly 40%, but pretty much just under 40% VO2 max, which means put your heart rate at no higher than about 55-60% of max heart rate. And we're talking about speed like less than 3 miles per hour. Okay, generally speaking, how they qualify or quantify METs for light activity. 3 to 7 METs is moderate, 40-70% VO2 max, 3.6 to 6.5 miles per hour, and about 7 or more METs, metabolic equivalents, is referred to as vigorous, and above basically 70-75% VO2 max and up, and then basically 6.5 miles per hour or above. So clearly every individual is going to have different responses here. On a given day, you might have different responses. On a good day, I certainly would be higher than that value, and I'm 49. For what they would say are high METs, but I might feel like it's more moderate. If I was at 7 miles per hour on a treadmill doing it, it might feel more moderate for me. On a good day, it should. That's relative to my specific needs. And certainly someone of a much higher level athletic prowess or ability would see even more so. They'd feel like it's moderate at 7 or 8 miles per hour, despite the fact this refers to 7 METs is vigorous and that level VO2 max, which may not be necessarily true for everyone. But it's a good broad-based standard. It's something to note. And it's really simple. If you're getting above 75% VO2 max, you're going more than 7 miles per hour, and it really feels pretty easy because you're well conditioned, and that's kind of the point, right? Aging and aerobic power after age 30, basically cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory. Those terms are often referred to back and forth. Cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory exercise, right? Even though they're slightly different, they're kind of referred to as generally the same. Fitness is estimated to be declining by about 10 to 15% per decade after age 30. Now, that's really lighter in the earlier ages, in the 20s and 30s. I'm already past it. 3 to 6% loss average in the 20s and 30s each decade, and up to about 20% or more at 70 plus. 80 plus where you see the big drop off. Looks like 25, 30 plus percent. Significant drop off for most people at the 80 plus range. Okay, and again, we're talking most. Okay, that said, heart rate also typically declines by 4 to 6% per decade on average. So your max heart rate is going to be lower. Your performance heart rate is going to be lower. Also expecting performance itself will be lower, right? Loss of performance seems to be most likely, however, due to skeletal muscle function loss. So, right, if you actually utilize your skeletal muscles on a regular basis, consistently, 3+ days per week at a reasonable level, looking at moderate to higher intensity, which we'll talk more about in a moment here too, then you can expect to see 50 to 65% attenuation of those numbers, meaning you're going to reduce you're going to make that decline of the decline less significant, okay? So in other words, you'd be cutting those numbers in half or even more than in half for the decline. Up to 2/3 cutting those. If you're regularly exercising, we're talking about aerobically, we're talking about 20, 60 minutes at least, 3 times plus weekly at or above the lactate threshold. And remember, lactate threshold occurs as low as about 40-50% in deconditioned individuals, can be up as high as 85 to 100% in extremely well-trained elite type athletes, but even 60 to 80% is pretty normal for at least someone who's fairly athletic for lactate threshold, okay, of VO2 max. That said, aerobic programming variables. Getting to the training aspects for aerobic power. Progressive overload is the minimum required to achieve improvement, right? Overloading the system. And of course, we've talked about this a little bit before. I want to make sure it's really clear. When we say overload, it doesn't mean go crazy. It means just do more than you're used to, and not by a ton, by actually a very small amount. I always love the analogy of water boiling. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius, and if you get to 101 Celsius or 213 Fahrenheit, you don't get a better boil of the water. All you do is lose water. So if that's true, that's true of all things from a standpoint of getting to the right level. You get to the right level, you don't try to do more than that. All you do is lose performance. You lose benefits. So we don't want to try to get absolute push you to the brink of passing out. Otherwise, all we're doing is testing your mental strength, or it's a punishment. It's not really improving, really clear clear idea here is that it's not going to improve physiological performance to try to train that way. Be more clear, specificity versus said. Specificity. You pick the right exercise to meet the goal. If you're trying to get better at a given variable of exercise, in this case aerobic exercise, you want to test on the surface, which you normally would be training, ideally, not just clinical, which clinical you probably should do once in a while to make sure you're seeing the actual valid, clinically tested results from a standpoint of basic parameters of someone being able to perform for longer periods at a given speed or be able to continue to perform at higher graded exercise. Heart rate hopefully being lowered, all those different levels where they get there, not in addition to their actual performance improvements, blood pressure dropping, so consequently showing you obviously a change in stroke volume. If we're talking about months, probably a left ventricular wall thickness. We have to do more sophisticated testing to actually know that for sure, as well as different parameters of aspects of skeletal muscle changes, right, which we'll talk more about a little bit here in a moment. That said, pick the right exercise to meet the goal. Really, really important. And said is what tells you if you got the right exercise adaptation. So specificity, pick the right exercise to meet the goal. Said, specific adaptation to impose demands. Whatever you ask your body to do, it will do its best to respond to the demands you place upon it. That said, if you don't train well, don't train properly, you have too short a rest, you train too often, or not enough, right? Or you get too much rest, the intensity is too high or too low. Any of those things, you will not get the proper adaptation to impose demands, and you won't get the performance result you're looking for. So it's our reminder that your body will do the best it can to respond, but you will only adapt to the imposed demands placed upon it from the standpoint of the body's capacity to handle that performance. Specificity is going to be your ability to find the right exercise to meet the goal, to be able to match up with the performance benefit you're looking for, okay, long term, over a period of weeks and months, maybe years. Now, to appropriately stress the ATP, PC, energy system, adenosine triphosphate, phosphocreatine, creatine phosphate, glycolytic aerobic pathways, one of the questions is which one first? Well, it really depends on goal specific. The book almost refers to more doing this testing here before you test these. That's really going to be questionable. Okay, from a standpoint of actual longevity, performance, ability to recover, aerobic pathways probably going to be best to be testing in general, unless you're talking about a speed and power athlete, in which case the aerobic pathways are going to be obviously taking a back seat. Definitely goal specific. What are your greatest needs? Standpoint of general population, this is really almost always the most important value. The ability to get through your day, not get tired, not be fatigued, not have issues with cardiovascular response, respiratory issues, blood circulation, basic skeletal muscle capabilities, and basically the ability to do basic activities. Aerobic energy is vital, the most important. This stuff is fantastic for high levels performance and for maximal performance in all areas. Okay, that said, book refers to fit VP versus what we tend to refer to, we meaning I and other people in the athletic field, fitness fields, or some variation of this. This being frequency, intensity, time, and type, and then basically volume and progression, okay, which I'll talk about more in a second here. And of course, this being frequency, intensity, time, type, rest, and rate of progression. Slight variance there. But I think it's important because rest is in there. Rest is not in this one. I think that's concerning. Now they're talking about aerobic here, but still got to mention rest. Now, in talking about frequency first, 3 times a week minimum for getting aerobic benefit. Okay, if you want to improve aerobically, at least 3 times a week. 5 is ideal, as much as 7 times for more advanced. Low intensity, generally referred to be 30 to 40% VO2 max, so under 40% for sure. From a standpoint of heart rate reserve, that's really using a Carbonin equation, which is simply taking your max heart rate minus resting heart rate, multiplying the training intensity goal expected, and then adding the resting heart rate back. So if you're 20 years old, we're using the 220 minus your age formula for max heart rate. You're getting 220 minus 20, that's 200. And say the resting heart rate is 50, pretty good. 200 minus 50 is now 150. You multiply it by whatever training percent intensity you're looking for today. Let's say it's 70%. 70% of 150 is actually 105. 70 out of 100 and 35 out of 50. 105. Add the resting heart rate back again, you get 155. The expectation for the day would be for low intensity, not going above 155. Moderate intensity in this case, but I was referring to it as 70%. Not above 155, even more toward high for heart rate reserve. What I just computed there, to be fair, was actually 70% of heart rate reserve. okay, for Carvonan equation. So there's slight variances in the Carvonan equation referring to heart rate reserve. You're not going to do any computations on an exam, to be clear, versus what we refer to as VO2 max, which tends to be anywhere between 10%-ish to about 15%-ish lower than the actual heart rate you're going to be seeing at the lower intensities, and it levels out as you get higher. So low intensity is, well, low. You feel like you could do it all day, well below lactate threshold, right? Moderate intensity, 40-70% VO2 max. It's where we see the greatest differences in immune system strengthening, right? The greatest differences in overall health and well-being, somewhere in that range is maybe a little below that 70% VO2 max, more towards 40 to 60 like we talked about before. 30 to 40 is for those who are not feeling great and want to make sure you get the low-level benefits of immune system strengthening and low-level benefits of just being out, moving, and doing things. That's the day for low intensity and the day to following high-intensity days. High intensity, it's referred to as 75 to 90% VO2 max, equivalent to roughly about 60 to 90% heart rate reserve. Okay, in athletic, we're looking at 90 plus percent VO2 max or heart rate reserve, and that's all for intensity. And again, you have to be looking at the heart rate. Heart rate reserve gives you the heart rate. VO2 max does not, but you can use either the Carvonan equation, or you can simply do a calculator. If you look online and find a VO2 max 2 heart rate calculator, there are many available to you if you want to compute the expectation for heart rate relative to VO2 max for a given person's age. And they're, of course, not perfectly accurate. That's why we do testing. Time-wise, or time under tension, or volume of training, any one of those. Time under tension I like to refer to from a standpoint of keeping tension going, or it's not really time of work. Okay, that said, 150 minutes moderate or 75 minutes vigorous weekly is expected for minimums. This is an or for the vigorous. We don't do vigorous unless they're already capable of the moderate, right? That's weekly time under tension. And then usually it's 20-60 minutes per session to get to that. You can go longer, but longer may not be the goal. Type or tool not specified by the text, what you're going to use. As I mentioned, if you're walking or running, you're testing on a treadmill lab, but preferably either the basketball court or the grass, the field, or the track, wherever is more specifically indicative of where you're going to need to be performing as an athlete, if that is the goal. If we're talking about the average population, I'd rather put them on a track. It's easy to control. And it's at least a moderately harder surface. They're on the ground typically. They're not walking across grass on a regular basis. You could use grass if you wanted, or a basketball court if you wanted, but the track would probably be best place to be doing that kind of testing. That said, walk run is always recommended first for typical expected life performance. People need to be able to walk and run when they need to. And that should be pretty obvious, that need, regardless of age. Well, then it should be at least the ability to be there when needed. Okay. You can always test on other tools. It's always a choice. Recovery, not mentioned in the text either. That's why it's in this version of referring to variables of programming for programming improvement or periodization, cycling of proper programming, right? It's not mentioned in the text. Really, you're looking at for aerobic benefit, 0 to 45 seconds between sets, up to 100% VO2 max. You shouldn't need a lot of rest between. If you go to 75 plus percent VO2 max and you're needing to get more than 45 seconds rest, it's probably because you're worn down. You probably shouldn't be doing high intensity exercise. You should probably be doing moderate to lower intensity, because 75% VO2 max, we're talking about from a standpoint of however fast you can run, how far you can go in 10 to 12 minutes, whatever your speed is. You're looking at 3/4 of that. It really shouldn't be something that's a big deal that you shouldn't be able to recover from in about 30 to 45 seconds. If you can't, totally fine, but consider it more moderate exercise for today, not high intensity for you or for your athletes you're training. Progression here for the P, or R here for the rate of progression, is 1 to 10% weekly at the most. Progression or the rate of progression. And we're talking about low intensity, always following vigorous days or higher intensity days all the time, no matter who you're talking about. The best of all athletes, still, low intensity follows high intensity. Very important, okay? And there's very little research to support, your book notes it, for benefit for doing dual days in general. Twice a day exercise, unless part of that time frame is focused on skill and there's other aspects of training. That's different. But from a standpoint of conditioning twice per day is most likely to simply fatigue people. Okay. And it's only for the elite of the elite to even consider such things, try to get as much as they possibly can in a week for trying to win a gold medal or being the best in the world or something along those lines, or your last year of training in a given sport. You want to get everything possible and you're already in fantastic shape. We can talk about double days. Otherwise, from a standpoint of conditioning, it's really just wearing someone down, although it's popular to do. We should first seek to increase frequency, how often you train. That's the first thing you should be looking to do when talking about what should I do to change, to progressively overload my body, my athlete's body, my patient's or my client's bodies to get them to improve. Then duration of overall work increases or duration of work sets, and then intensity. That's a general time frame, a general expectation. Those can be variable depending on someone's goals, but it's probably a pretty good way of looking at it. Warm-up and cool down should be 10 to 15 minutes long. Static stretching should be first and last, if at all. Shouldn't be referring to static stretching as being part of a warm-up or cool down. It's its own thing. It's toward flexibility, loosening up. You do static stretching before the warm-up so you can actually get someone completely loose, and then use the warm-up to get the muscles to be able to fire appropriately, to get the right muscles to fire in the right sequence, at the right time, at the right levels, all those things. Okay? We're not just going to looking at static stretching will loosen you up, which is great, but it may not be what you want necessarily right before you begin a set. It's not going to hurt performance necessarily, but it won't necessarily help it. It's going to loosen you up so it doesn't inhibit it. There's a big difference there. Doesn't keep you from performing. You're really trying to get someone to normal when you're static stretching someone before you train. It's a good way of looking at it. Static stretching gets you to normal before you train. Not trying to get super normal or like the warm-up is trying to get you to be able to perform at maybe a higher level with an accurately performed or adequately performed warm-up. Cool down is also 10-15 minutes. And we've talked before a little bit about variations in hot and cold, but you're going to go longer for both those if it's cold and shorter for both those, like 3 to 5 minutes for extreme heat. And that said, long and slow is for recovery days, light, low days, at or well below your lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold. Generally speaking, referred to as being the same, even though anaerobic threshold technically occurs just after the lactate threshold, but it's close enough that we often refer to them synonymously. And obviously, one's testing blood lactate, one's actually doing more aerobic testing, so to speak, or testing your performance from a standpoint of cardiovascular performance. So technically, they're not the exact same thing, but we kind of refer to them synonymously. But long and slow days should be days following in high-intensity days. A fartlek is basically speed play, Swedish word for speed play. Talking about vigorous or high-intensity stuff. Fast, slow, fast, slow. You don't take a break. It's fast followed by slow work, slow-ish, but you never really stop, okay, until the whole thing is done. That said, you do cycles within that. So typically speaking, it's also mentioned by the text because it's very specific here, it's highly recommended you try to do at least 4 sets. Okay, when you're ready for doing fartleks, 4 sets is ideal. 2 sets just doesn't do much for you, and other than sharpening you, so getting you to taper downward, that's different. For actual conditioning, 4 sets, and not more than 8. There's really no reason to be doing 12, 15, 20 sets, things like this. You'll know because the performance will wane. And if you're just out there running around or just cycling a bike randomly, you don't really know. But you should be seeing the heart rate not rising significantly with every single set or performance waning, right? And 30, 90 seconds work, the opposite, 90 to 30 seconds rest should go with it. So if you're going as much as you can go for 30 seconds work, you should be doing 90 seconds rest. If you're doing 90 seconds work, which is probably going to be lower intensity because you can handle it for longer periods, you look at 30 seconds rest. Hopefully that makes sense. Tempo runs, steady state between 80 and 90% heart rate reserve, which again is kind of equivalent to, roughly speaking, somewhere in the 75 to like 85, 90% of your VO2 max, possibly higher, right? Above 75% VO2 max. And that's about 20, 30 minutes for a tempo run, okay? The attempt is to be kind of steady state-ish for a tempo run. Aerobic intervals, are expected to be anywhere between 3 to 10 minutes, 3 minutes, because that 3-minute time frame is where you start to become more predominantly aerobic. And I think we actually mentioned in a previous slide or previous presentation that 2 to 4 minutes is typically what you have to, how long it takes to get up to steady state. That's why all those graded exercise tests are done every 2 to 3 minutes, because you're trying to see steady state before you change the next level. And of course, for those aerobic intervals, we're looking at 0 to 30 seconds rest between, because we're not trying to get more than about 70% ATP. And if assuming a healthy individual, why would you be doing this if you didn't have a healthy individual? At least from a standpoint of doing intervals, you would just simply do something, or you do super light intervals, in which case you shouldn't really need much rest because it's so light just to get someone going. The whole purpose of intervals is breaking up work because the person is unable to do that same level of work at that same intensity without taking a break. It's really that simple. You don't have to do intervals at all. But the whole idea is to get you to a higher level of performance by asking a little bit more intensity out of a person, but shortening the work periods and giving very brief rests, trying to accumulate the total amount of duration and of work to actually reach the point where they don't need to have those rest periods from the standpoint of aerobic. You're going to have to get some rest periods with anaerobic type work, but not necessarily aerobic. Okay? Cross training, real simple, very goal specific. If you're someone or you have someone who really wants to see a broad-based balance in their strength and their cardiovascular performance as a whole, athletic performance that requires combinations of aerobic performance and anaerobic type performance, then you got to do some cross training. Cross training is not something you need to spend a great deal of time balancing out with other forms of training. If you're just trying to get someone at a reasonable level of aerobic performance, you'll do some strength training, some cross training, maybe once or twice a week, but you're going to be doing 3 to 5 or more days toward the aerobic improvement. It depends, it's very much goal specific and readiness at a standpoint of, something we'll talk about near the end of this class, for when you periodize a program, how you change those variables over time. Okay, but cross training in and of itself, let's be really clear, when you spend time performing toward one aspect of training, you're going to lose benefit in something else. It has to be always said. A lot of people don't seem to get that. Just because you have someone who has a high VO2 max and add strength training to them doesn't mean they're going to be a better runner from a standpoint of their performance in a 5K, 8K, and beyond. Theoretically, you should, because now you have someone who has a high VO2 max and now they're stronger too. Well, you're assuming that when you did that strength work, you didn't take away time that could have been focused on VO2 max, so they lost VO2 max while you're working on the strength training. You see the difference there? It's really important to understand that. It's not right or wrong either way. It depends on the needs upon the person we're training, whether they're the average population, the ill or diseased population, or an athlete. Okay. Overreaching versus overtraining. If you need to take more than a few days off, you're going towards overtraining. If you take a few days off, you're just overreaching. Your heart rate was a little bit high for what you were doing normally. Your performance was actually a little low. Your resting heart rate is probably a little bit high. Heart rate in general is high. Blood pressure is usually a little higher too at normal performances. In extreme states, overtraining, heart rate can actually be low and you can't actually see, you try to increase your intensity, you don't feel good, and the heart rate doesn't go up either. That you can't. That's the extreme state of overtraining. Assuming someone's not ill, some sort of disease or illness or issue, we're talking about severe deprivation, or I should say, or decline in hormonal performance, nervous system performance, affecting, of course, muscular response as well. All those things. You got to take a lot of time off, weeks and months off. Probably not years, but weeks and months for sure, maybe years. I had to take a couple years changing up my program, lightening things up until I finally figured it out, able to return to normal performance after 2 years of wearing myself down from several months of high intensity training that I wasn't ready for and not supporting myself appropriately with proper rest, nutrients, and so on. Okay, but overtraining is pretty obviously noted, or overreaching, I should say, is first noted with a lack of performance. You see someone performing normally, and then all of a sudden that's not normal, consider it's overreaching. And you can actually cut it off before it gets to overtraining. Okay, and some people say that you actually exhibit a lack of interest in training when you're overtraining or overreaching. From my perspective, that may be true of the average population. An athletic population, no. They actually want to go out and work out harder because they're not frustrated because they're not getting anywhere. And that, of course, gets them nowhere, right? That said, aerobic training induced skeletal muscle changes. The goal of improving ability of skeletal muscles to generate ATP during exercise is aided primarily by hypertrophy, which means 6 weeks or more till your skeletal muscle actually sees significant hypertrophy from the standpoint of those muscles used in your aerobic training. Not every single muscle of your body, right? Only the muscles you're using in training. The myoglobin content of skeletal muscle can increase by as much as 75 to 80%. Not shocking. Obviously referring more specifically toward the type 1 fibers, but also type 2 fibers. And increased capacity to completely break down carb increases in the presence of oxygen and or oxidizing or breaking down fat. And that's due to mitochondrial adaptation and biogenesis, or increase biogenesis, referring to the increase in the number, size, and surface area of mitochondria. That's big. That's occurring, of course, from regular cardiovascular exercise. And mitochondrial volume density can improve as much as 100% in 6 weeks. That's a significant change in just a few weeks. Some changes occur in little as a week, which we'll talk about in a second here. So obviously that's why it's important to not miss a week, not just because of the overall benefit long term, but in the benefit in short term. You don't want to miss days. You really don't want to, and get the exercise in. Key oxidative enzymes in the Krebs cycle and proteins and electron transport chain system may increase by 35%. It's going to help you get adequate proteins and breakdown for protein synthesis, both in terms of healing, in terms of performance improvement, in terms of getting proper nutrients to the system by a significant amount there. Muscle glycogen stores increase by 2.5 times. So that's why people can perform glycolytically at such a much higher level with adequate training over time. That's going to take, for muscle glycogen stores to increase 2.5 times, it's going to take some practice and some doing for a period of weeks to get there. Okay. That said, intramuscular fat stores increase 1.5 times. Fat increases, but fat within the muscle, which if you gain muscle, you're going to gain some fat. And the theory is the muscle actually helps have some glycogen sparing by also having fat present there as well. That being said, you can't have muscle without fat. Can't have it. Okay, every pound of muscle you gain some fat. Much less than a pound, but there's fat there. Suggested by the Irvine text that intensity above 70%, duration more than 30 minutes, and frequency greater than 4 times a week is needed to induce significant high fiber hypertrophy over time. So you got to be getting in 4 or 5 days a week, more than 30 minutes in per day, 70%, above 70% duration or intensity to see significant hypertrophy of muscles that are being used in training. Obviously, it means you're going more towards high end of moderate or higher intensity to really see significant hypertrophy changes. But to be really, really clear, that's not entirely accurate. Okay, it's not. Doing low-level aerobic exercise for someone who doesn't do any of it at all is going to see over several weeks, more importantly months, some hypertrophy changes in those muscle fibers they're using if they're getting in the 3 to 5 days a week. That part's absolutely accurate. The frequency. The duration, probably. But the intensity, not necessarily. No, that's not true. The intensity is one variable I'm going to argue significantly here is not necessarily true for hypertrophy. Unless you're talking about type 2A and type 2X muscle fibers, then we're talking about this intensity. But for the type 1 muscle fiber hypertrophy, that's not necessary. The duration and the frequency, though, yeah. Okay. Number of capillaries per fiber is increased by 10 to 30%, or can be, over weeks and months. That said, loss or gain of specific muscle fiber types, if you train type 1 fibers, type 2A or type 2X are going to be declined to some extent. If you train type 2A or type 2X fibers, you might be seeing some decline in type 1. That's not terribly surprising. And when you detrain, you're going to see typically a loss more of the type 1 fibers. Aerobic response is what gets lost first, which is hugely important to note from a standpoint of performance and really important to note from a standpoint of overall well-being. You don't want to stop on the aerobic training. You can maintain benefit and growth performance-wise, not maintain growth, but maintain what you've grown, so to speak, over time, much easier with the type 2A and type 2X fibers than you can with type 1. That's important to note too. Type 2 tends to increase and type 1 decreases with detraining. Okay. That's important to know. So if the goal is more towards having aerobic benefit, that's very important to know. That's concerning. Increased left ventricular size, we talked about a little before, and wall thickness is greater in males than females, but females get it as well, along with increased stroke volume are going to occur from proper aerobic training over time. Decreased training heart rate and resting heart rate. Some of that's thought to be to the sinoatrial nodes reset, recognizing it doesn't need to have the same response, certainly due to increased stroke volume, but more importantly due to skeletal muscle adaptation to stress, which less need coming from the cardiovascular system for blood volume to get nutrients, get oxygen to the tissues because of the adaptation of the muscle to stress, can perform more work without going anaerobic, without needing as much. Okay. Increased blood volume by 20-25% in the first week can happen. Okay, it doesn't mean it's going to increase that same level for every week thereafter, but just from 1 week of training, that's tremendous for health values in a given week. And beyond, hemoglobin levels by 20-30% over months. Okay, increasing the oxygen basic carrying capacity of the blood. Right, decrease in blood lactate at submaximal exertion. That's phenomenal to note, meaning whenever you get your maximal levels will change, right? Lactate threshold will go up over time with training, but your blood lactate levels at submaximal levels will be much lower than they were with proper training. Peak aerobic power, VO2 max can increase by 10-25%, but as much as 30% or more. It can actually increase up to about 50%, depending on someone who's detrained in some unusual situations. That 10 to 25% number is more on average. In all probability, someone who has fairly decent genetic capabilities and has been training to some extent, but not a lot, really engages heavily in training within several months, certainly within a couple years, can increase their VO2 max probably well above that 25%. Okay, but that's a good average number. And they got to be training to really maximize VO2 max. You're looking at 85+% VO2 max training, the high intensity interval training, the really high level of those steady state type tempo type runs, or same would be true on a cycle or in the water. Same exact concept in those surfaces in those areas for training. That said, our final thoughts. That is chapter 6 in a nutshell, and we'll do just a little touch, kind of finishing it up towards chapter 6 in week 12, and we'll talk about chapter 7, anaerobic power as well. This should give you more than enough for doing well on your exam. If you have questions, you have comments, let me know. Otherwise, happy weekend to you, and we'll talk to you, near you again soon.